Welcome to the Breakpoint Podcast. I'm Shane Morris, here with John Stonestreet in our new Q&A edition, answering the questions we get from you, our readers and listeners. John, I want to know something. What's the most ridiculous question you've ever received in this job?
Oh, I think the most ridiculous email one, the most question, it probably came from you somewhere down the line, Shane, as an
Thanks.
employee. No, I'm just kidding. No, I think the most ridiculous line, I always think of the guy after we did something on the Charlottesville deal
Right.
that happened a couple years ago. And we said something about the alt-right and, described who they were and why, it's a non-Christian worldview and so on. And I actually got a comment by somebody who said, I've been around the alt-right for years. I've only met 3 Nazis. And that was his defense of the alt-right. And of course, my response was, how many Nazis do you have to meet before it's a bad movement?
What's your Nazi
one.
quota? What's the maximum number of Nazis per million that you can have?
I'm pretty sure one does it. I'm pretty sure just one is the one that just says you're in the wrong
Okay,
movement.
well that beats what I got this week. I just wanted to throw this one out there. Someone asked in my call for questions for this program, someone asked, would you rather fight 100 duck-sized horses or 1 horse-sized duck?
Wow. Was this
I have no idea.
On your Facebook feed?
It was.
That says a
I have
lot.
no idea
Okay.
how to answer that question.
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's get to a real question here. We got a question here from a reader who says, I believe we should never put an adjective in front of the word justice because it's unnecessary. There's only justice and injustice. When we say racial justice or social justice, we start leaning into favoring someone or some group subjectively to try to even the playing field. That idea just plays into critical theory because it forces us to view people as either oppressors or oppressed. Thoughts?
Well, it's a good question. There's no doubt that almost all of our conversations about justice have been are hard to have anymore because it's the conclusion has already been assumed depending on which group you're a part of, whether you're part of the oppressor or the oppressed group, which means kind of the whole critical theory thing has overtaken the conversation. It's not unlike when I speak to students about marriage. I go back to studies from like 2008, 2009, and I tell them that the reason is because after that, almost all studies have been hijacked, by the LGBT, movement and the necessity of being politically correct on those things and so on. So if you go back before critical theory, you will find the word justice specifically applied to specific situations, right? Race would be one of them. Socioeconomic would be another one. And so I guess I don't have as much problem putting an adjective in front of it, although I know what the questioner is saying, as I do just kind of knowing the blind spots. I mean, part of it, the danger with not, at least whether we call it an adjective or not, the danger of avoiding kind of adjective and then avoiding kind of having the conversation all, in that way, is that we'll never get specific to specific injustices. And it gives us a blind spot, I think, to groups that are saying, hey, something's wrong. And you and I have been talking about this ever since the George Floyd incident, and actually before that, I'm not going to chalk up nearly as much to racial injustice as so many other people in America, but I also want to acknowledge that I probably don't understand the injustice that's there as much as I should.
Sure.
And if usually someone who is just kind of rabidly opposed to making any specific application has already decided, just like somebody so committed to using words like racial and social as adjectives, have already decided on the side of critical theory. And I don't want to decide up front what the issues are, because the fall affects all people at all time. Does that make any sense?
It makes a ton of sense. I would say that slogans are one of our biggest problems today. It's that issue of deciding questions ahead of time with slogans and then forcing everyone to sort of line up on one side or the other. There are, biblically and philosophically, there are different types of justice. There's distributive justice and retributive and positive and negative. You can describe the different dimensions of justice, which is giving people their due, in a number of different ways, and those are valid ways. And I'd say the abuse of that concept of putting adjectives in front of justice doesn't invalidate its legitimate use. Now, with the specific issue of social justice or racial justice, I think those can become loaded terms where
Mhm.
we end up assuming so much ahead of time about the person who uses it that we should be careful about how we use those. So it would be a matter of prudence for me, is that when I'm trying to communicate a concept to someone, whether it's, let's say it's the question of not discriminating against people based on the color of their skin. The reason I'm against that is because it's irrational, and because everyone's made in the image of God, and there's no difference between a black person and a white person or what have you that is relevant to the way that I treat them in everyday life. There's just no difference. And so it would be irrational for me to discriminate on that basis. And so justice in general as a concept would require me to treat that person equitably. Now I can describe that as racial justice. The problem is if I use that term, then people are going to start assuming that
Mhm.
I buy into a lot of stuff that I may not buy into. And goes back, John, to the same question. This is the same discussion we had a couple of weeks ago about the Black Lives Matter slogan, because that slogan pulls in a whole mess of associations with the organization Black Lives Matter and all their other, additional goals, things that they've cited as their end goals for society. So I would say it's a matter of wisdom. Use a modifier in justice if you think it's going to help you make your point and communicate what you're trying to say. That's a valid and true concept that Christians should embrace. And don't use it if you think it'll be more of an obstruction to your communication.
And if somebody else uses it, ask. I mean, I
Right.
think that we get accused all the time because we use a phrase like racial justice of kind of kowtowing or bowing down to critical theory, which, if you follow us at all, you should know that that probably isn't the case. So that's why we always say, hey, look, keep that question, what do you mean by that, in the back of your, in your back pocket. I think that, a lot of people that use, for example, the phrase Black Lives Matter don't have any sort of extra connotation to all the Marxist or anti-family, pro-LGBTQ destruction of the family philosophy that
Yeah.
the organization does.
They just mean it in its literal sense.
They literally, yeah,
Right.
that's right, and they're doing it in a culturally appropriate time. But but we should at least have the charity when someone does throw an adjective in front of a word like justice. I agree with the questioner that a lot of times that is code word for a whole host of ideology. But the least we can do is ask.
Yeah. Yeah, I agree. Let's move on to another question here. And this is one with infinite applicability and infinite potential for you to drop jabs on me. So we'll see how this goes. And this was actually submitted by a friend of mine. She asks, "How do we engage graciously on social media?" Want to take a crack at this first?
Well, I think the short answer is it's impossible, and your Facebook page is proof of that. No, I'm teasing. I'm teasing. Look, I think that we have embraced social media without first asking as Christians, like, what's the point here? What's the
Hmm.
purpose here? Just like we do almost always. All the proverbs still apply. I guess the way to engage graciously on social media is to take proverbs seriously, right?
Ooh, I
Don't
like
answer
that.
a fool according to his folly. Do you know how much Twitter traffic would go away if we just followed that proverb? A soft answer turns away wrath.
Right.
We would be a lot less interesting on social media, and it would, generate a lot more light than it does heat.
Hmm.
If we would just follow the proverbs. So my short answer to Shanna is read Proverbs over and over and over again. Psalm 1, read that. Don't hang out with the ungodly. That includes on social media, right? I mean, there's just so many different applications, I think, of Proverbs that we can play on this. And but while we're at it, let's at least listen to one of the things that Jesus said: if your right arm causes you to sin, cut it off. Right? If
Hmm.
Twitter causes you to sin, if social media causes you to sin, cut it off.
Right.
It's not worth it. So anyway, I think there's lots of ways biblically that we can do that. We often teach the strategy of just asking questions, the importance of asking questions. To do it with a level of confidence is needed when you're in a conversation with anyone face to face and with social media. So that's another way, is to kind of create a dialogue. And then the last thing I'll say is, Shane, is we got to know when to walk away. I mean, so much of
That's
these
good.
conversations are pointless. Just walk away.
Yeah, that goes back to the answering a fool according to his folly advice in
Yeah.
Proverbs. Well, I'm going to be a little bit radical here. I would actually, contrary to, let's say based on my own experience, not contrary to it, I would question strongly the value of engaging on social media as such. So, and the reason I'd say that is because it's not built with reasoned and productive exchanges and debates in mind. That's not its purpose. Its purpose is to generate clicks and direct eyeballs and gather information on people. And that's not conspiratorial. I'm not positing any sort of insidious plot to subjugate us. I'm just saying that's what it's for. It's literally the economic model of Facebook and Twitter. And it's in service of that goal, it's built to stoke and feed off of outrage and clever digs and so forth. It's meant to make people mad and get them going at each other's throats, or else engage with just sort of frivolous stuff. So I don't think it's wrong to be on social media. Otherwise, I wouldn't be on it myself. And I've spent an inordinate amount of time on it over the course of the last few years. And it's benefited me in some ways because there have been a lot of intelligent people I've engaged with, but it's also been frustrating in a lot of other ways. And I would just say you should question very strongly up front, without necessarily offering a dogmatic answer, whether it is wise for you to engage with social media. If you must participate, I'd say obey the rule of love, the law of love. So don't treat anyone differently online than you would in person. Remember that these are actual real people. They're not just avatars. They're not just profile pictures that you can, slam and abuse. Assume the best about what they're saying. Try to read them charitably. When they say something, don't read it in the worst possible light. That's a continual problem on social media, is that there's no context. There's no facial expressions. There's no human contact. And so you immediately start reading. We all do it. We all read people's comments in the most offensive and sarcastic and snarky way we could possibly read them. And then more often than not, people will come back and say, whoa, why the defensiveness here? I didn't mean it like that. And, we could avoid a whole lot of headache if we just assume the best about each other. And then lastly, I'd say recognize that the people on social media have stories and motives that you don't know about. They have contexts and lives behind the scenes and reasons for the passion with which they engage, just as you do. So we should all be willing to cut each other a little bit of slack there. And again, obey that law of love. And remember that these are human beings you're dealing with, created in the image of God. And if you wouldn't say it in person to someone, don't say it online. And not just because you might get your lights knocked out if you said it in person.
Yeah, that's all really good advice. I think the approach that I've taken is that I have a platform, right, and I get to say what I want to say, and we edit the heck out of everything that we say. And because of that, when people disagree, and I do have people that disagree, I don't respond to them, unless there is some key point because I don't think that most social media platforms are legitimate for that. They're legitimate tools. Like you said, they're not built for that. And so I'll use them to put a piece of content out there that I think is interesting or that we've done. But then I've said my piece, and, we have plenty of people that try to kind of, stoke responses from us. And we just don't. It's not worth it. The platform is not adequate. And so I say my piece, you say your piece, and then on we go. So that's almost always the way I engage. But remembering that there's a real person on the other side is a very, very important part of this.
We get another question here from a listener who catches us on KNLR in Oregon. And this listener asks,
in Oregon, who knew? In Oregon, I mean, that's a state. Who knew we had any listeners all the way up there?
There are dozens of them in Oregon, John. I know many of them. We talk a lot about, this listener asks, we talk a lot about women when we deal with abortion. What about fathers? What is our stance on their role and responsibilities? How can the pro-life movement reach them?
Well, I think that this is such a loaded question, and we've done several breakpoints throughout the past several years having to do with this. I think more and more pregnancy resource centers are recognizing the need to not only, reach women at the point of crisis, but reach women afterwards. And then it was like, well, wait a minute. If women have guilt because of abortion, men probably do too, and they need to find forgiveness. There's also, because the way that certain things are set up in our society, the very real possibility that men don't have a say, and they would actually choose life, if they had the choice, and the woman or family members or whatever, that decision was already made. And I've met so many people like that who feel like they didn't have a voice. And so that's another, place where we can engage men, or we need to engage men in this particular conversation. But the deeper one, I think there was a, we just talked about social media, so maybe it was a meme or something. It's like, if only there was something we could do, when a man got a woman pregnant, to keep him around so he wouldn't walk away.
Right.
And everyone's like,
that was some feminist on Twitter was actually saying that, is like, look, if abortion's going to be illegal and a woman can't escape the consequences of unprotected sex, then neither should a man. He shouldn't be able to just walk away either.
Yeah, that's called marriage.
Yeah.
That's what society invented.
I think it was Matt Walsh who said that. He was like, hey, congratulations, you just invented marriage.
Yeah, no, but it's true. I mean, this is why, and I often talk about this to students. You look back through history, and I owe this insight to Glenn Stanton, but you look back through history and you can find what society gave you written law, as opposed to the king's fiat. And you can find which one gave us some sort of representative democracy and handwriting and things like that. You look back and you try to figure out which society gave you family, and you can't find it.
Right.
Why? Because the debate was, we have these babies, who's going to take care of them, right? Maggie Gallagher sums it up this way: there's three realities, which is the reason that marriage is ubiquitous, and marriage and family. And that is, sex makes babies, society needs babies, and babies need a mom and a dad. Because those three realities won't change no matter how much birth control you throw at it, or how enlightened a society is. So the best thing we can do about men when it comes to this issue of abortion is advance marriage. It really is. Advance male, because here's the thing: when you advance marriage, you advance male responsibility. The loss of marriage has given men all the power in the sexual exchange. If you want to look this up, this is some insights from Mark Regnerus on a video, and please Google this carefully, called The Economics of Sex. Who has the power right now?
If you Google it wrong, you might get the Wolf of Wall Street.
Yeah, you might. Listen, it is. You need to Google it with your mom in the room, is what I always tell kids. But it's such an important insight, which is, look, we promise women freedom so they can, we give them birth control. We've gotten rid of the stigma of single, motherhood. We've gotten get rid of the expectation of, just get married and be barefoot and pregnant. We've given them access to, education, all of which, by the way, are good things. But the freedom that we promised when we untethered sex from marriage is a freedom that they never got. In fact, the men got the power. So women now cross the threshold of adulthood way earlier than men, far more commonly. And men still can demand whatever sex that they want. That's what marriage is so important. So that's what we can do. I know that's not specifically about abortion, but in a sense it is. Marriage makes men behave. It's literally that simple. Marriage makes men behave so that they can get wives. And that then keeps them around, as opposed to abandonment, which is really one of, if not the top cause of abortion.
And part of the brilliance of Regnerus's insight there is that he recognizes that the desire for sex is, not to get too explicit here, folks, but this is true. The desire for sex is one of the key motivators that brings young men into adulthood. And in a society where it's set up so that women control access to sex and demand, because it's such it incurs such a high price for them, they demand a high price in return, rightly so. And so they demand a lifelong commitment and marriage and the pledge to support any offspring that result from that union. And that's just a description of marriage in purely economic terms. We're not saying that's all it is, but in terms of the pure economics of the motivations of what's going on there, that is an accurate description of marriage.
Yeah, listen, let me just speak to that, because you should not see your own marriage on economic terms.
Right.
That's not a way for it to survive. But societies, it's literally the marketplace of marriage. Who has the supply? Who has the demand? And the whole, and there's power structures and power boy, that's a loaded term, isn't it? Power structures, but
Yeah.
there's influence and there's power,
It
as
sounds like that
that.
social justice issue we were talking about earlier, John. Be
I am
careful there.
woke. I am woke, Shane, as you know. But but this is a really important thing, and women have been disenfranchised of the power and influence that they had.
Which is why we have so
Um,
many men who are just failing to grow up now, because they have no motivation to grow up anymore. They've got not only easy access to consequence-free sex through birth control and the general cultural allowance
right.
for that, but they've also got 24/7 access to pornography, which blunts their desire for sex as well. And so no wonder we have such a problem with indolent man children who are just sitting around and playing video games all day.
Yeah, that's right. And to our listener in Oregon, um, men absolutely have to have that sort of responsibility. And I'd also say that on a long-term perspective, as opposed to just kind of saying, okay, what's this man's responsibility in this pregnancy situation, which I hope that, we'd be crystal clear on. It's, raise your sons to be men, not to be
Mm.
boys. We have a whole chapter on this in A Practical Guide to Culture. It's one of the cultural undercurrents, the ways things have dramatically shifted over the last several decades. We call it perpetual adolescence. Or some people call it Peter Pan syndrome, which is a really funny line. But
I would be okay with that, except I've been unfavorably compared to Peter Pan in the past, and
that's
I
because
have.
of your boyish looks, I guess, right? And you never grow old, and
That's exactly right.
is that what it is?
I live in Neverland.
It is Florida,
We have
which is
crocodiles.
not that far off, right?
Right.
The eternal playground of, yeah, we'll keep going.
Well, our next question here is one that's a very 30,000-foot theological question, and it has to do with the core of what we talk about and teach here at the Colson Center. This listener asks, how does our heavenly and eternal perspective of life affect our worldview in culture? And I assume also the way we live out that worldview in culture.
Yeah, this is a great question, and it would take an entire course to unlock it. And I think that oftentimes I would see in two main areas is how this impacts our Christian worldview. First is if you have a vision of heaven or eternity, whether you're a Christian or non-Christian, we have a vision of the end times. What's the culmination of history? Where's history headed? What's it look like when everything's made right again? And whether you think that is, first of all, possible in this world without a Messiah, without Christ having returned. And if you think that, then you think that there's some sort of human technique through government, through science, through some sort of way where you can usher in utopia. Well, if you can usher in utopia through human ingenuity or human technology or human technique, then that's really going to affect your worldview about, the value of individuals getting in the way of your agenda and all kinds of things. As opposed to whether you think that you're joining in a rescue mission by a salvation that's coming from the outside. So that's one area. It's whether we're utopian or whether we're not. There's also the issue of whether we're Gnostic or whether we're not. In other words, if you think that heaven or eternity is a disembodied future, in which the bad part of the world, which is the physical, goes away and we become disembodied souls or spirits floating around on clouds, then your worldview is going to be impacted. And this is really an internal question to Christianity, because we have certain visions of the end times which really denigrate the future of the world that God created. Do you think the world that God created was fundamentally good, or was it fundamentally evil? If it's fundamentally evil, then it's not worth saving. There's nothing worth redeeming or restoring. If you think, for example, that the problem with the world is our flesh, right? That the line between reality is drawn between the physical and the spiritual, which, by the way, is a Buddhist thing to do, an
Yeah.
atheist thing to do.
I call that the Yoda worldview. He tells Luke, we're not made
It's
of
a
this
dualism.
crude matter. We're luminous beings of spirit.
Right. But people think, in fact, C.S. Lewis, people often throw around a C.S. Lewis quote, about, you're not a body with a soul, you're a soul with a body. And I've never liked that, because honestly, what
Did
the
he actually
Bible,
say that?
Well, it may be one of those misattributed ones, like preach the gospel at all times and when necessary
Right.
use words. It's really Lewis and St. Francis of Assisi. They get a bad rap for things maybe they never saw. But yeah, maybe we should Google that. But I see people share that as if Lewis said it. If he did say it, it doesn't make any sense because he was an anti-Platonist. So he shouldn't have said it that way. He didn't mean it the way it's used
So it's definitely
because
he definitely didn't say it. So that's even better. It says
oh,
check
is that right?
check
Is
your
it? Are
facts. Says
you on
this.
the fake C.S. Lewis quote website?
Oh, there's so many of them. Yeah, it says this saying does not appear anywhere in C.S. Lewis's
Yeah.
collected works.
So it gets shared as if he said it. And the problem with that quote is that God didn't to be a living soul, if you go back to Genesis chapter 2, is the process of God forming man out of the dust of the ground. That's physical. Breathed in him the breath of life. That's spiritual. And the result of the physical spiritual union is that man became a living soul.
Hmm.
In other words, the Bible does not draw the line of reality between the physical and spiritual. The Bible draws a line of reality between the creator and the creation. And the creation has both physical and spiritual aspects. And when God created the world with both physical and spiritual aspects, he looked at all that he'd made and he said, it is good. Now, if you think it's bad, if you think our problem is that we have skin, if you think that the real problem is that we are human, and that humanness is bad, to err is human is another thing we often say, which isn't true. To err is fallen human, but to err isn't human. And that's a real big distinction. Then you don't think anything in this life is worth preserving. You don't think the good, which is one of the questions we often tell people to ask, what good around you can you protect, preserve, and promote? Mm-hmm. Then there's nothing fundamentally good about a job well done if it's not spreading the gospel, or there's not something fundamentally good about a painting that is good for being a painting. Dorothy Sayers' line that the only Christian work is work well done makes no sense because, well, if it's building a bridge or digging a ditch, then it's not really Christian work because it has to do with the physical, not the spiritual. So our view on eternity, whether we think eternity is a non-physical future, is going to impact it. And by the way, that's wrong. Make yourself the sworn enemy of Gnosticism. It's the heresy that never goes away, and it really hurts us. Or what you think about, whether the eternity is going to be ushered in by human effort or whether we need rescue from the outside. Those are the two angles on this. I think this is such an important question for Christian worldview. Because a lot of things fly in the name of being moralistic, but violate a Christian worldview in one of those two sorts of ways, if that makes sense.
Right. The best book that I've ever read on this subject, John, is, and I know you love it too, is N.T. Wright's Surprised by Hope, which is, of course, a riff off of Lewis's Surprised by Joy. But it's about our ultimate destiny and the resurrection and how in the West, our Christian imagination lost the idea in some sense of resurrection being our ultimate goal, of the final state of glorified new heavens and new earth being what we're looking forward to. And therefore, the implications that eschatological truth has for our present reality and our dealings in this world. Let me ask one quick follow-up question here, because I know that many who are familiar with Scripture will be anticipating this. What about all the passages that speak of the flesh as something that's bad? How is that not equivalent to the sort of skin is bad statement that you just made?
Yeah, I mean, it's essentially the flesh isn't talking about skin. The flesh in Paul is talking about something else. It's talking about a way of imagining the world as if God isn't there, as if the world itself is godless. It's basically a secular vision of reality. In other words, I can do what I want, and as long as I can get away with it, then it's not wrong because there's not really a God over everything that's in charge. That's an example of this kind of practical secularism. Another way to describe the flesh and how we tend to order the world as if God's not in charge. It's what theologian Craig Gay in his book, and I think he's got a wonderful dealing with this concept of the flesh and what is meant by that in his book, The Way of the Modern World. He calls it practical atheism. It's basically a way of seeing the world vertically as opposed to horizontally. It's not about physical versus spiritual. That's not what's happening in that word. And by the way, we can see this on a number of places where even in the use of the word the world or worldly, that's not an immanent versus transcendent way of doing it. It's seeing reality again from a completely horizontal without a vertical axis.
That's John's parallel idiom. The world is in John something similar to what
the world. What John does with the world is what Paul does with the flesh,
right.
And it's basically telling us is that we are dependent beings. This is the psalmist saying, "You're known, no matter where you go, up into the heavens, down into Sheol, you are known." This is John also saying, "For God so loved the world." I mean, what world is he talking about there? And so anyway, there's a lot of ways to see this. I loved your recommendation, by the way, of Surprised by Hope by N.T. Wright. Michael Whitmer actually has written a wonderful book called Heaven is Not My Home, which I think, where was it? It was just recently. Was it on our last broadcast where you said something about the sacred cow hymn, "Turn Your Eyes Upon
right.
Jesus"?
Yeah, we were talking about
It was talking about a recommendation, the book that you had read that you wanted to share.
Oh, we're talking about Joe Rigney's book.
Joe Rigney's book, right?
Strangely Bright.
Which, by the way, I think would be also a good resource for this. But this question, but this is another sacred cow. This world ain't this world's not my home. I'm just a passing through, or whatever. Do you know that song?
I sang that in Baptist summer camp so many times.
Yeah, that's a really old one. But this would be another one where Michael Whitmer is saying, no, heaven, God made you earthy. The end of time is not a blown up world and everyone goes to another planet. The end, I always like to do this, when I talk about the story of the Bible, and I'll say from creation to new creation, from the beginning till and everyone will say the end. And then I'll yell at them and say, no, that's not where the story, Revelation does not take you to the end. It takes you to the new beginning. This is like Narnia, so begins chapter 1 of the great story, with no one on earth has read, in which every chapter is better than the one before, or whatever he says there at the end of the last battle. That's really one of the best descriptions of what you get in the last book of the Bible, is that there's a new beginning happening.
He says, as he quotes the last chapter of the last battle verbatim. Well done, John. That's a great note to end on today. And that's something that
C.S. Lewis did say that, for the record. We know that. He did. That is not a fake quote.
We can give you book and page number for that one. Well, thanks so much for listening to the Breakpoint podcast and our Q&A session. We'll be back next week answering more of your worldview questions. Drop us a message on social media or email at askthecolsoncenter@colsoncenter.org, and we'd love to engage with it. For John Stone Street and for the Colson Center, I'm Shane Morris. We'll see you next time.